Hello, and welcome to the third in our audio dispatches on the left chapter. This is Michael Laxer. I hope today finds you well under these trying circumstances of the capitalist coronavirus crisis. Today I wanted to take a look at how one nation, in contrast to many others, has really risen above and beyond in its internationalism and in its efforts to help other nations and peoples during the coronavirus crisis, and that is socialist Cuba. Just this week alone, Cuba sent doctors to South Africa, Honduras, Cape Verde, and Argentina welcomed Cuban medical aid, while at the same time denouncing the ongoing American economic blockade of the island. Cuban doctors have gone to countries around the world, including, in the most desperate of circumstances, such as in Italy. And, in doing so, they've carried on a long-standing tradition of showing solidarity with other countries in times of medical crisis and in times of, disaster. Now, in contrast to this, of course, the United States during this period has not only, at various points taken steps to prevent aid or equipment from going from the United States to other countries, but the United States has also actually intensified its sanctions campaigns against countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Iran. And, I must say that doing so under the circumstances of a global pandemic is increasingly amounting to what can only be called a kind of war crime. I mean, these sanctions, the sanctions, for example, against Cuba, they're completely illegal under international law. They have no moral justification at the best of times, and they certainly have no moral or other justification right now. And the same applies. In the case of Venezuela, there are reports that, like many other countries, they are facing widespread hunger and other, issues as a result of the pandemic, and yet the United States has taken this as an opportunity to ramp up its attacks on the legitimate Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro, and has done so, for example, by placing a $15 million bounty on his head, like out of some old John Wayne movie. It's completely absurd, as well as forcing companies that are still operating in Venezuela to further shut down their operations, as well as applying even greater economic pressure. And of course, this is having a profoundly negative effect on Venezuela under these trying circumstances, as these sanctions have now for several years. As they get worse and worse, the Venezuelan economy is being, strangled essentially. You can't step away from the fact that the same is going on in the case of Cuba. The Americans also seem to be using the pandemic as an opportunity to intensify pressure against Cuba as well. They have. For example, they blocked Swiss medical supplies from coming to Cuba. They've blocked various other supplies from getting to Cuba. For example, the Swiss Medicuba and Swiss Cuban Association said that the U.S. blockade has imposed an enormous burden on Cuba's health system and is, directly endangering the lives of many Cuban citizens. And this is, it's completely outrageous. And while this is going on, for the most part, Canada has been, and Canadian politicians have been completely silent about this, including the New Democratic Party, Canada's alleged Social Democratic Party, which has not said anything officially about the ongoing sanctions and blockades of other countries by the Americans, even though in light of the coronavirus, these are especially egregious and appalling. It's really important now for people to stand up and be counted, and to do whatever they can to protest the ongoing sanctions and the effects that they're having on different countries. The Sao Paulo Forum, which is a sort of leftist umbrella organization in South America, was founded in Brazil, has started a petition campaign. I'll link to the petition in the description on YouTube. But they started a petition campaign and Twitter and other campaign, public campaign called Blockade No, Solidarity Yes, which aims to call on governments and the United Nations to take further steps to demand that the United States end the embargoes and the blockades. As they note in the petition itself, they say that in the midst of all of the pandemic problems, some nations that have already been the victims of unilateral coercive measures have unsuccessfully requested the lifting of sanctions in order to purchase supplies, medical equipment, and medicines for their health system. They say that in view of this, they're calling, of course, that the blockade and the unilateral coercive measures and sanctions be completely lifted, and that the millions of people who suffer unfairly in their daily lives because of these will be allowed access to the kind of medication, food supplies, and essentials that they need in the face of this profound illness that's affecting the global community. And I think that we need to, I hope everyone will sign the petition, but in addition to that, we need to contact our MPs and demand that they speak up about this, that they do something about this, and that they call on the Trudeau government to make a statement asking the United States to drop sanctions. In the case of Venezuela, through its disgraceful role in the so-called Lima Group, Canada has played a very large part in creating the entire sanctions system that's being used against Venezuela right now, and that has been used to cripple its economy in its efforts to oust the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro. And, they have, it's really important now for them to make amends for this as best they can by abandoning this sanctions regime in this time of crisis. I mean, it's totally unacceptable for these sanctions to be continuing in these circumstances. In addition to calling on that, I mean, what this situation is really exposing again is the incredible hypocrisy of these kind of actions on the behalf of, on the part of, I should say, the Canadian government and the American government. While these sanctions are being intensified against Venezuela and Cuba, you have countries like Bolivia, where there are widespread human rights abuses going on after the coup, the overthrowing of Evo Morales, the coup by the far right and sort of racist elements within Bolivian society. After this coup, there were no sanctions placed on Bolivia, even though it has become completely apparent that there was no legal or democratic basis for the ousting of Morales, and even though elections now appear to have been put off indefinitely. Another example is in Chile, where after protests broke out last year, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people were wounded, blinded by police. There was, stories of widespread abuse. Many people were killed in this incredibly brutal government crackdown against mass protests. But no sanctions were placed on the Chilean regime of any kind. We could go on and on. I mean, in Brazil, you have Bolsonaro, who is pretty much an overt fascist, also a coronavirus denier. He came to power after what amounted to a soft coup, with the jailing on trumped-up charges of Lula, who would have defeated him in the Brazilian elections. But, far from placing sanctions against Brazil, in fact, Bolsonaro was fairly warmly greeted by the Trudeau government, and they've had very little to say about his actions subsequently. Very little to nothing. It's no longer... I mean, it was already profoundly hypocritical that these sanctions were in place. It was already completely unacceptable that we were participating in this attempt by Western imperialism and American and the American imperialist government to strangle Venezuela. So under these conditions, continuing to remain silent and to, impose these kind of embargoes and blockades against Venezuela is simply outrageous, and it can only again be called what amounts to a crime against humanity, and one that we as Canadians are fully complicit in at the moment. Please take the time to contact your MP about the need to lift sanctions internationally, globally, and during this humanitarian crisis. They should be lifted permanently, but they are absolutely unacceptable right now. And also, at this time, I think it's important for us to engage in signing petitions and supporting things like the No Blockade, Yes to Solidarity campaign. So, thanks for tuning in, and I hope everyone remains well. And hopefully we will see the sanctions ended, and Cuban internationalism and solidarity will prevail.